we're now going to raise this curtain, and you can take your seats there. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to present the moderator for today's panel discussion with the prize recipients, Judge Bernice Donald, also an advisor to the Justice Prize who serves on the selection committee. Judge Donald served on the U.S. District Court for Western Tennessee since being appointed by President Clinton as Tennessee's first black female district court judge, January of 1966, the same year in which Chief Justice Rehnquist appointed her to the Judicial Conference Advisory Committee on Bankruptcy Rules. She has this year received the American Bar Association's Liberty Achievement Award and has begun her first term as the American Bar Association's first person of color to serve as secretary of the 400,000 member group. Judge Donald serves as faculty for the Federal Judicial Center and the National Judicial College and is a member of the Board of Directors of the Federal Judicial Center. She's a former member of the Board of Governors and the House of Delegates of the American Bar Association and currently serves on the Council of Litigation section. Immensely respected by her peers and by us, she is a champion of women's rights and encourages younger members of the profession with much enthusiasm. Judge Donald.
Thank you, Pat. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to be here this afternoon on the occasion when the EERC, represented by Robert Cushion and Isabella Mihalake, and Brian Stevenson received the 2009 Peter and Patricia Gruber Justice Prize. What a wonderful occasion. And I am so grateful to each of you for being here to help in that celebration. Now, you've heard something about the recipients, but I know you want to have an opportunity to dialogue, and I'm going to try to facilitate that process. But before I begin, I want to extend my personal thanks to Judge Carroll and the Cumberland Law School for hosting this event. It is most meaningful. I want to start the questioning by asking a general question and offering my congratulations to each of you. You know that our theme today is access to justice for underserved populations. And as Brian Stevenson said, what better place to have this conversation on the occasion of this prize than in Birmingham, Alabama, which is largely believed to be the birthplace of the modern civil rights movement. We know from our knowledge of the area, and if we've gone to the Civil Rights Museum, that justice is born of struggle. Dr. King said that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And we know, many of you are law students, some of you are lawyers, others of you are in higher education, but we know that laws are not self-executing. There are many documents which extol the virtue of equal rights, equal justice, human rights, but the practices do not mirror the documents. And so justice depends on the efforts of men and women like you, individuals. It needs your hearts, your hands, your energies, and your compassion and commitment to make justice a reality. The people here have extended themselves to make justice a reality for these underserved populations. And I want to start by asking just a general question to which I'd like each of you to respond. And that is, tell me what you have found to be the most significant barriers to access to justice for the populations that you represent today, in 2009. And we can start with Brian Stevenson.
Well, thank you, Judge. I think the big barriers that we face have to do with the law, but also with just political development. Mass incarceration has radically reshaped American society. In 1972, there were 200,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2.3 million. And that tremendous increase in the number of people being sent to jail and prison has not been accompanied by an increase in the commitment to providing legal services to that population. And so, in my view, this development, this evolution of using the criminal justice system as a mechanism for dealing with a lot of problems is one of the big barriers. The second problems relate to the way in which we enforce rights. In my state here of Alabama, we have a lot of people who cannot get access to effective legal assistance. And the American criminal justice system is very wealth dependent in my judgment. Our system treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And that does not characterize a system that, in my judgment, is fair and reliable. And to correct that, we've got to provide better access to lawyers and legal services. I represent people on death row, many of whom are literally dying for legal representation. At any given moment, we have anywhere from a dozen to 20-some people on death row in Alabama with no legal representation. We have half the people in the state on death row who are represented by attorneys who, by law, could not be paid more than $1,000, even in the last several weeks.
Let me interrupt you, though, because you say that there are people on death row without representation. We know that under U.S. law, an individual who is accused of a crime that carries the possibility of incarceration is required by law to have a lawyer. So how can this be in the richest country in America with a sound system of law that requires representation? How can it be?
We haven't defined what that providing a lawyer means. And so what essentially the courts have held is that, yes, you're entitled to a lawyer at trial and in the initial stage of appeal, but after that, you're not entitled to a lawyer. There have been some 130 people who have been exonerated, proved innocent after being sentenced to death. All of those exonerations took place in proceedings where there is no right to counsel. And even where you have that right to counsel, again, in Alabama, half the people on our death row were represented by lawyers who, by statute, couldn't get paid more than $1,000. And so that's not a meaningful right to counsel in our view.
Okay, well, before I go to Isabella and Robert, I want to dwell on this because obviously we're in a time in this country where all states have many competing obligations. And a state that has an obligation to educate its children, provide health care to its citizens, and do a myriad of other things. I mean, can the state reasonably be expected to allocate what some might say is disproportionate resources to individuals on death row? I know that death is different, but how should a state balance that?
Well, no state is obligated to execute people. And my judgment is if you want to engage in the luxury of executing some of your citizens, you've got to make that commitment to make those executions fair and just. In the absence of that, I believe you create the kind of injustice that undermines all aspects of the society. I mean, if we're serious about trying to balance our economic resources, we would stop spending billions of dollars, more billions, on incarceration for nonviolent offenders and a whole host of people who are not a threat to public safety, and instead invest those billions into education in these other areas. There's a direct correlation between the decrease in spending around public education and the increase in prison construction and mass incarceration. So I don't believe that these things can be pitted against each other. And at the bottom line, if we commit to providing services to people in a complete and meaningful way, we eliminate all of these debates. We just had a decision in our state court here that has held there is no right to counsel on direct appeal to the Alabama Supreme Court in a death penalty case, which means we now have people who can't even get that level of review. That's a judgment that, in my view, threatens not just the plight of those people on death row, but all of us in this state who want to believe that our state is committed to justice in a way where we don't have to worry about executing the innocent or treating unfairly those who are poor.
I'm sure we'll get back to that because it's an incredible discussion. But I want to turn to Isabella and or Robert to ask you to respond to what are the obstacles that you see to providing access to justice in these underserved and marginalized population. And I'll leave it to you on who wishes to begin the conversation.
I'll begin the conversation, then I'll ask Isabella to fill it with content. Brian's remarks were quite reminiscent of the situation in Europe, although I think in Eastern Europe in particular, we're in a much more resource-poor setting. But the absence of a firm legal obligation to provide counsel, except for a sort of general requirement in the European Convention on Human Rights, which talks about providing counsel when the interests of justice so require, has meant that in many countries the legal obligation is quite porous. In addition, a lack of legal services and legal aid for particularly legal services and legal aid targeting Roma communities. But moreover, there's a profound lack of faith in and awareness of the justice system, and people in Romani communities simply don't trust the justice system to deliver justice. Isa, maybe you want to take off on that a little bit.
Definitely. I mean, when it comes to the lack of faith in the legal system, I just want to refer to a recent report that the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency has published this year that is called discrimination against Roma in 7 member states. And that's illustrative of the way people refer to the legal system in itself, because mainly big majority of people, around 72%, responded that basically they don't report instances of personal victimization, of assault, harassment, because simply they don't have the confidence that the police can do anything about it. And there are people that fear also that there's going to be negative consequences if they report, where they are afraid of the perpetrators, where in some instances 36% to 40% basically responded that they fear of the police because of previous negative experience that they have with the police. So that's kind of illustrative of the way people refer to the legal system in itself. And I also wanted to touch upon it, unless you want to continue on this.
Well, Isabella, before you do that, let me just, you mentioned that some people don't report victimizations because they're concerned, and part of this is based on past perceptions that the police are going to
in some of the cases, it's the police itself, it's the perpetrator.
Okay. So is this belief simply born of past actions, or does it still reflect a current reality? I mean, are the Roma community members still being victimized by law enforcement?
Right, that's an important question. Yes, it does reflect on current situation. And just an example, I think it was Czech Republic or Slovakia, where you had 5 or 6 police officers that put children to hit themselves, and they obliged them to get naked in a police station. And even so, they even recorded the scene and they posted on the YouTube just to exemplify the extent of violence, and even the belief of the police that there's not going to be punishment for that. And also the disbelief comes also from the fact that, for instance, in Hungary in the past year, we had 8 hate crimes against Roma, and there's been no perpetrator found guilty, which obviously is related directly with the efficiency of the law enforcement and the commitment the police has into finding the perpetrators. These are just very few examples, but I could continue.
And I know Robert wanted to make a further comment, but before he does, let me just say that members of the Gruber staff have cards, index cards. If you'd like to pose questions, they'll be going through the audience collecting your cards. If you want a card and you don't already have one, raise your hand. Someone will bring you one. But we'd love to have your questions, so get them to us. And Robert, I think you wanted to make a comment?
No, I think Isabella summed it up. We can move on.
Well, I just wanted to ask again for the ERC, has expansion of EU membership affected access to justice for the Roma in a measurable or positive way? And if not, why do you think that is?
Well, again, let me offer some general remarks. I think European Union membership has had very limited impact. The biggest impact, arguably, was when many of the countries of Eastern Europe became parties to the European Convention on Human Rights, and then joined into this regional enforcement mechanism. But when states become members of the European Union, they're asked to undergo certain reforms in the area of justice, but very little of that is really rights-focused, and very little of that trickles down to the level of meaningful change for Roma. And Isa, I don't know if you want to talk about the example of Romania, which is one that you know well.
Yeah, and I also would like to also actually refer generally to the EU member states after accession, and more precisely to the equality bodies, because they are the monitoring bodies that look at discrimination across Europe, and the ones that collect complaints against discrimination. To say that throughout the European Union member states, you can see that this is a very deficient mechanism that lacks many times the budget to implement activities, and they don't have enough human resources to reach out to different communities to raise the awareness of people about these mechanisms to enforce human rights. And what I can say is that as Rob has strengthened that, my personal view is that in the process of accession there is more to it. There is more leverage for countries, for NGOs, civil society, to actually push for more sustainable and consistent human rights system of the countries. But unfortunately, so far, the Copenhagen criteria on minorities has never been the defining criteria for a country to access the European Union. And although the reports foresee already challenges for including the Roma population into societies, the countries don't really act on it. And once you are in the European Union, it's so little you can do as the European Commission. And as we can see now, we have within the European Union hate crime that is going unpunished, and the European Union not being able to respond with the member states to counteract the situation. And then it's very worrisome, and then it makes you wonder whether this is something that we should push for, meaning the membership of the European Union, or maybe it's better to actually push the states to highly consider whether the country has really managed to progress on integrating the minorities, and to actually, I think when it comes to Roma, it would be very considerate to think of having a separate maybe progress report on the situation of Roma people, just because the report as it stands speaks only about the situation of Roma in health, situation of Roma in employment, and it always recommends to member states that progress has been made, but there are still steps that the country has to do. There is no specific steps that the Commission is actually advising for member states to take, meaning there is a lot of flexibility for the countries to decide on where they have to improve and by how much. There are not actually concrete indicators by how much a country has to improve on integrating its minorities, so that it basically coincides with the requirements of the European Union.
Thank you. I want to go back to Brian now, because Brian, you are obviously a very distinguished lawyer and professor. You are respected and known across the land. Law firms would love to have you. Major law firms would love to have you as a member of their staff, and yet you've chosen to do this death penalty work. Isabella talked about perceptions for a little bit, and I know that there are some issues with perception in the justice system here in the United States. I want to just ask you, why have you committed your talents and your life's work to this cause, and I want you to also talk about some of the things that that the EJI has accomplished, and from a policy standpoint, where do you want this country to be as a country? Because I know that we stand almost as one of just a couple of countries that still has the death penalty. Mm-hmm. So I know that's sort of a three-part and kind of a disjointed question, but let me hear you.
Well, I appreciate the question. I think that all societies have to remain vigilant and deeply committed to what being a just society requires. I mean, listening to Isabella reminded me of how easy it is for us to congratulate ourselves as being beyond discrimination. Discrimination goes with myopia. We're very good at seeing other people's problems, but not very good at seeing our own. I went to Budapest in the late 90s and spent some time with the Roman Rights Center, and I was there to talk about the African American experience in this country and about the history of segregation and marginalization and how I thought it related so directly to the experience of Romani people throughout Eastern Europe. And people were quite willing to accept the history of abuse and discrimination of African Americans in America, but very unwilling to accept the parallels with Roma people. And to me, they were quite obvious. And it's in part because we don't do enough, I think, to really commit to what confronting justice means. I mean, even here, I spend a lot of time now in rural communities. We have a new project working with the Black Belt. We have some wonderful people, Catherine Flowers and others, who are helping us in this region, where you meet people who are still carrying the legacy of apartheid and segregation, who are still bearing the burdens of that history. And older people come up to me and they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear people talking on TV about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history. They're very provoked by this notion that the 9/11 was the beginning of terrorism in America. They say, I grew up with terrorism. I grew up having to worry about being bombed, about having to be threatened, worrying about being lynched. These communities were created out of a fear of racial violence. And we still live in these segregated situations because of that history. And so it makes me angry when people are talking about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history. And that anger carries with it some trauma. And that legacy and that history and those injuries are, in my judgment, things we have to reconcile. We've got to address. So part of why I do what I do is because in many ways these problems that have been a long time in the making are going to require decades of dedicated solutions. And I think we have too quickly forgotten about all of the wounds, all of the injuries, and we have too quickly stopped trying to think honestly about what a just society requires. And that leads to the kinds of problems that our office deals with at EJI. We're again trying to recover some vision, some commitment to dealing with these problems. And it is complicated, it is and sometimes overwhelming, but I think it is essential for a free society, a just society, to recognize these issues. That's mostly why I do it. I also do it because I just have very basic beliefs. I believe that each person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. I learned that growing up in a poor community, in a community of color, surrounded by people who made mistakes. And I've just come to believe that every person is more than their worst mistake. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. And because of that, there's this basic human dignity that must be respected by law. And if we ignore that human dignity, we imperil all of us. Martin Luther King used to say the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. I never understood that until I stood with a condemned person who was facing execution and advocated for him. I also believe that in this country, that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. That in a country as wealthy as America, we can do better than have 38.5 million people living below the federal poverty level, families of 4 with household income of $13,000. In states like Alabama, we can do better than have whole counties where the median income is $10,000 a year, where there's 45 to 49% illiteracy in 2009. And because of that, I do think there is this need to act, this need to do something, this need to say something. We do have some wonderful icons, and they have in some ways shaped my work. When I was a young lawyer here in the 1980s, Rosa Parks, the great matriarch of the civil rights movement, came back to Montgomery. I had the thrill of spending some time with her, and she came to visit 2 other wonderful people we have in Montgomery, an amazing woman by the name of Johnny Carr, who was the architect in many ways of the Montgomery bus boycott, and another woman named Virginia Durr. Her husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King. And these 3 women sat on her porch for about 2 hours talking. They invited me over there. And I just sat there and listened to them talk for 2 hours, and it was the most inspiring thing. And there's a lot of people, Jerome Gray and others who are here, who have fought these fights for so long. And when you listen to them talk, you get really excited and energized. And I just sat there and listened. And finally, after 2 hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, now, Brian, now tell me what the EJI is and what are y'all going to do? I started giving her my rap about what we were trying to do and how we're trying to deal with the death penalty and life imprisonment without parole for 13 and 14-year-old kids and mass incarceration and wrongful convictions and abuse of power and all these things. I gave her my whole rap. And when I finished, she looked up at me and she said, that's going to make you tired. And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, that's why you've got to be brave. And I really think that this is not a time for us to be so exhausted by the challenge of overcoming slavery, overcoming segregation, overcoming discrimination, that we stop. Or for us to be so unwilling to confront the complex problems because they require courage. I think that's essential if we're going to have a free and just society.